Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about IEP teams and integrated service delivery. So far, we have been following the narrative arc around special education with respect to uh, what the law is, what the law requires, how special education law IDEA came about, sort of historically in America, what the requirements are for schools and teachers with respect to search and find and noticing a student, how we go through the assessment process and get us to the IEP and making some choices about services, supports, accommodations, modifications, and least restrictive environment. Uh, so one of the things we want to think about is, who's going to be on the team? Who are all the people that are working together to collaborate and bring about this free and appropriate public education, this offer of FAPE uh, for the student that will be represented in the IEP. So there's going to be lots of people involved, right? We've got to, of course, have our general education teachers, special education teachers, school administrators, any relevant specialists for services that the child might require through their IEP program. So here's a list of possible participants. Notice, of course, that the parent and the student are on there too, right? Those individuals are extremely important members of the IEP team and perhaps the most important as they are the sort of highest level stakeholders in this process. Required under law, under IDEA, you should have an administrator at an IEP, a general education teacher at an IEP, a special education teacher at an IEP, and the parent, and then any other relevant service providers. Sometimes there are occasions when administrators may designate someone else on their behalf to run the IEP as an administrative designee. That could be a school psychologist, it could be a special ed teacher. There are times when maybe you might not have a general education teacher present if the child is receiving, all of their special education services at a non-public school for students with special needs. Um, other individuals like a school psychologist may only be present on a team, every few years when they've done a full assessment. Um, there may be times when you're having an amendment IEP where not all members, or service providers are present, but only maybe a service provider for which the meeting has been called to review that service or that goal. So the teams do fluctuate, but basically we're looking at stakeholder participation at all levels. Parent, student when appropriate, and certainly as the student gets older, we want them participating as much as possible and perhaps throughout the entire IEP meeting. And then the other stakeholders, special education, general education teacher, and relevant school administrator. So now, when we come to the end of that IEP and we've made a number of determinations about goals, services, and the amount of time that those services will be required to offer free and appropriate public education, and the least restrictive environment or the place in which this program will happen, whether it's in general education classrooms, special education classrooms, a mix of both, right? We're also going to look at how the services themselves, be they speech and language or occupational therapy or physical therapy, vision services, whatever the case might be that the student needs, we're going to examine how those are delivered as well. So when we think about services in typical school environments or maybe classic sort of service delivery in special education, we often think of specialists focused on specific things or specific parts of functioning for a student, not necessarily concerning themselves with anything beyond their area of specialty, and coming into the child's classroom environment, whatever that might be, and pulling them out of that, doing their specially designed instructional service, their designated instructional service for the child, and then bringing them back to the classroom, right? And they get to kind of check the box and say, great, that's my 25 minutes of speech and language. I focused on that speech and language portion of that child's educational program for the allotted time in the IEP, and I brought them back to the class. And we wouldn't find a lot of integration among those specialists or among maybe even the goals of those services and service providers. Well, what might that look like? Well, here's a picture of a student's day in a typical service delivery model. The student arrives and peers say hello, but the student keeps walking, doesn't respond. 8:15, the student's in homeroom, begins a modified journal activity. But they only get 10 minutes into that when the speech and language teacher comes and pulls them into the speech and language office to work on greetings. 8:50, the student leaves speech. Period 1 has already begun. The paraprofessional helps to begin the math assignments and takes the books out of the child's book bag. 9:40, they walk to period 2 in social studies. In social studies, the class is doing a role play about feudal Europe. 20 minutes into that, the para prompts the student to go to occupational therapy. And in occupational therapy, they work on fine motor skills of using zippers and opening containers. 35 minutes later, student goes to nutrition with the paraprofessional who opens up the snack for the student, right? So we can see a lot of the disjointed quality of that student's day, not only in their physical presence in a wide variety of environments, but also in the disjointed quality of the service delivery and whether or not it generalizes into actual school contexts for the child, or whether it just gets practiced in the service provider office, but not necessarily generalized into the school settings where the child is interacting with other students and other adults. We often hear, or I often hear, comments back from, service providers, teachers about, the problems with traditional models of service delivery, or what we call pullout, that it can be fragmented. Teachers will say, well, they go to speech and language, but I'm not sure what they're working on. There's not that connection or cohesion between the adults, the experts who are supposed to be working to help the child. They also tend to be deficit oriented. We are looking at the things they cannot do, and we pull them out and we work on those things that they cannot do, and we will continue working on them until they master them. One of the challenges with that is, though, that's not often how life works. We don't keep working on a single skill until we master it in sort of detriment to our overall goal. Most human beings are goal oriented. If we can't get our needs met one way, one of the beauties of being a human being is our ability to problem solve and figure out new ways to achieve our goal, to change the context of the scenario so that we can get what we need. And when we are only deficit oriented, we don't allow children to use their other strengths or gifts to solve problems or get their needs met in real context of the classroom. And we see this across all kinds of school settings, across all kinds of school services, that kids have difficulty generalizing what they learn. They may be able to do a skill in the resource room or solve a certain kind of problem in the resource room or write a certain kind of paragraph. But when they get back to the classroom, they struggle to generalize that skill. There's not all the scaffolding that exists in the resource room, in the occupational therapist room, in the speech and language pathologist room, when we're practicing these things one-on-one, do not exist in a real world context. So he may have mastered this skill in 4 out of 5 trials in the speech room, right? He can greet the speech teacher with appropriate pacing and intonation when they're in a one-to-one session, but does that transfer into actually, you know, going through their day and doing that in context with peers and other adults? So how might it look differently? Well, we can think about integrating service delivery and staging things so that skills and practice of those skills actually happen in context. And what might that look like? So 8 o'clock, the student arrives at school and peers stop Becky to get her attention and wait for a response as they have learned from the speech and language pathologist. So the speech and language pathologist doesn't have to be there physically present to provide the service in that particular moment. She actually could have thought through that scenario, worked with some positive peers, and trained them on how to help Becky practice this greeting skill. 8:15, homeroom, modified journal activity. She's practicing picture vocabulary to write about plans after school, raises hand to share. She stays all the way through homeroom because she doesn't get pulled out for the speech and language session. 8:40, walks to period 2 with friends, struggles to take a book out of her backpack, but does so with a zipper pull that has been created by the occupational therapist. 9:40, at social studies class, is doing role plays about feudal Europe. The speech and language pathologist, instead of that pull-out time an hour prior, has now planned to be there in the class as they are doing a role play, right? Communication and interaction in the context of a content area class. The SLP facilitates interactions in Becky's group, noting her progress in expanding oral responses, which she notes in her email to the team later that day. Integrated service delivery requires us to communicate to the whole team. We're not practicing in isolation. We're not in our little knowledge silo. We're actually sharing our knowledge and our observations with everybody so everyone knows what's going on. 10:35, go to nutrition with friends, takes out own snack. OT, who's not there in the occupational therapy office, but out there in the environment of the school, is noting her progress opening containers and talks to her about using both hands. OT shares some ideas for different containers with the student's mom and mentions strategies for bilateral coordination in her email, again, to the whole team later that day. So we see a couple key features there in integrated service delivery. One is that the service providers are there in context, in the moment, in the classrooms, in the school environment, not necessarily just pulling that student into an isolated setting in a service provider's office, but there in the context where real problems and real solutions happen. And then they release their knowledge, their information, their strategies out to the whole team so that everybody's on the same page. And this is the outcomes and sort of the conditions we're looking for in an integrated approach. Skills are contextualized. They're not isolated and decontextualized. They're actually being used in the moment, in the classroom, in the school environment. All team members are responsible, right, for helping one another serve this child so that they can meet all the goals in the IEP. If a child meets or does not meet their speech and language goals, that's not solely dependent on just whether the speech and language pathologist does their job. It's actually all of us in a shared responsibility helping that child meet those goals because those goals are in common. The family's thinking and working about those goals. The teachers are, the service providers are, the paraprofessionals are. We all know what those goals are for the child in the IEP, hold them in common, and we're all working toward them. And we all share our information and expertise with one another, right? And that's where we get our collaborative model of assessment and intervention. We have all of these experts with the student at the center. And within our expertise, note that we have overlapping areas of information and knowledge. And we're sharing across our areas of discipline. We're not just staying in, it's not a stay in our lane kind of approach, or, that's not my area of expertise, I can't help you, or I don't work on that portion of the student's IEP. No, we all work together. We're all integrated as one whole, sharing our expertise, sharing our knowledge, using common approaches, using common strategies for the benefit of the student who's at the heart of this effort so that we can help that student achieve the goals we all hold in common for them. And I think that that's where we also push on the big concept that we've talked about before of medical model versus social model. In a medical model, you have discrete experts who have knowledge that they use to solve isolated problems, right? They're specialists, and they're going to fix whatever that problem is. And that probably, on a certain level, drives that discrete pull-out model approach to service delivery. Where in a social model, we're actually trying to conceptualize how the student can function in the context of life and school and implement contextualized strategies, skills, knowledge in that social context, right? And if we need to make environmental adjustments, we can do that too, because we're concerned about the whole classroom, whole school, whole child, interconnection. And we have a belief in the social model that I can't just take them out of the context of the school and classroom, fix this little thing, bring them back, and then that will make everything better. There are connected and contextual issues to be considered and worked out in the classroom. And that's where the work of those service providers needs to rest. And research backs this up. When we look at some of the findings from research, we see that students are better able to apply skills when they're taught in context, that students with moderate to severe disabilities are less likely to benefit from pull-out instruction than students with mild to moderate disabilities especially. So if we're really talking about working with our students with more significant needs, we need to understand that, pull-out instruction can be problematic for anyone, but even more so for our students with more significant disabilities. We also know this takes a lot of work. This isn't easily done, and you need a whole school and system approach to put the foundation in place to encourage and support and sustain this high level of coordination for integrated service delivery. It's a little bit, more technical to have all of these systems of communication and to keep everybody on the same page. and really focus on working as a team, it's a lot easier to have a caseload of 20 kids come and you pull them 25, 30 minutes at a time and go back and forth from your classroom to the office. That is a little, a little more straightforward, a little easier, but it doesn't get you where you're going if in the end you actually aren't yielding the results for the student and the student isn't meeting their goals. But integrated services require a high level of coordination. And what we also find is that um, when those service providers are working with students in inclusive settings, they actually have higher expectations for the students they are serving. They expect more because the student is in that contextual environment and working in the context of non-disabled peers. And high expectations uh, can be very supportive, important things for all students, especially those students with disabilities. Some of the other characteristics of inclusive service delivery models, we're going to release roles. We're not just going to stay in our lane. We're going to share information. The goals themselves reflect that the goals are going to be worked on in a classroom, in context, in the sort of general education space. We have parity among team members. We're all working together. No one person, has more authority or more say about the student's program than the other. That doesn't mean we don't honor one another's expertise, but we are all team members. We've created systems to communicate and dialogue and have that shared space to release our information and our expertise. Maybe that's a Google Doc, maybe that's email, maybe that's weekly debriefing meetings. We collaborate about the design of the modified activities and materials for those students with more significant disabilities. We report on the progress, the reports on the progress reflect on the independence of multiple skills. So we're reporting not just on did they meet this discrete goal in this many discrete trials, but we're talking about how they are displaying skills in the context of the classroom with other peers. And then, of course, we're sharing resources among the team members. When we find out something new, when we have a new strategy, when we have a new program, we're working together to talk about that and implement those strategies and programs. Here's some related resources that may be valuable for you to take a look at that are on the internet for your support as thinking through sort of the benefits and of integrated service delivery and some of the challenges that come with trying to create a highly effective integrated service delivery program for our students included in the general education classroom.